In this video, we'll be going over 10 advanced pivot table tricks. Please comment below after watching the video and let me know which tricks are new to you. And if you're still a beginner in pivot tables and would like to learn the basics of pivot tables in 10 minutes, you can watch our last video. I will leave you the link down below in the description. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first trick that we have is creating calculated fields. So calculated fields are calculations that we can perform in pivot tables. So here we have two fields in our pivot table. We have the sales amount and the cost of goods sold. So let's say that we need to create a calculated field that would calculate the profit by subtracting the cost of goods sold from the sales amount. So to do that, we can select any cell in our pivot table and then go to the pivot table Analyze tab on the ribbon and then go to Fields, Items and Sets and click on Calculated Field. From there, we can start naming our calculated field, which is going to be profit, and then we can write the formula to calculate our calculated field. So it's going to be the sales amount. We can insert it by double clicking on it, and then we're going to subtract from that our cost of goods sold, which another way to insert in addition to double clicking would be clicking on Insert Field. And then to add the calculated field to our pivot table, we can press on Add. If you'd like to add more calculated fields, you can start typing the new name and the new formula and click Add again. But in our case, we don't want to add any other calculated fields, so we're going to click OK. And as you can notice, we managed to create a calculated field that calculates our profit, which is basically the difference between our sales amount and our cost of goods sold. And as you can notice as well, our profit calculated field has appeared here in the pivot table field list. So calculated fields are a useful and powerful feature in pivot tables that allows us to perform calculations in pivot tables. The second trick that we have is showing the rows that have contributed to each calculation in our pivot table. So for each calculation done on our pivot table, for each number that we have here, we have some rows in our source data that are the reason behind that number. And to show these rows, you can just double click on the number on your pivot table and you will find here the rows that have contributed to that number or to that calculation. And you'll notice here that because we double clicked on the CPU sales amount number, we only see numbers for the product being the CPU. And it shows you these numbers in a new worksheet. You can always, of course, right-click on the worksheet and delete it if you don't require that data anymore. You can also show that data by right-clicking and then going to Show Details. So that's another way to do it in addition to double-clicking on the number. And of course, if we double-click on a different number, then we'll see the data for that number. So here in our case, we double-clicked on the number for the laptop. So we got the laptop rows here, and we'll just delete these rows for the laptop and delete the ones for the CPU as well. However, if you would like to disable showing the data behind your numbers for any reason, you can right click and click on Pivot Table Options, and then you can go to Data and you can just uncheck Enable Show Details and click OK. This way, if you double click on a number, you can see here that you get an error message. We can't change this part of the pivot table. And if you right click and click on Show Details, you will also get an error message. Show Details has been turned off for this pivot table report. So this is how you can disable showing the details for your numbers on your pivot table. All right, so the third trick that we have is connecting a slicer to multiple pivot tables. So we've explained slicers on our previous video where we explained pivot tables in about 10 minutes, and I'll leave you the link down below in the description. But a slicer is simply a filter, a better looking filter than adding a field to your filters area. And to insert a slicer, you can just select one of your pivot tables here and go to the Insert tab on the ribbon and click on Slicer. And then let's say we're going to insert a slicer for the vendor, and here's the slicer that we've inserted. And now this slicer is connected to this pivot table. So as you can see here, when we change the vendor, the numbers on the pivot table on the left change. However, we can also connect the slicer to the pivot table on the right. You can do that by right-clicking and then going to Report Connections. And this is where you will see a list of your pivot tables, as you can see here. However, as you can notice, the names of the pivot tables take generic names such as pivot table 1 and pivot table 2. And this is actually something that you face when you have a lot of pivot tables in the same workbook. So it's always a good idea to give your pivot tables distinct names when working with lots of pivot tables in a workbook. So click on Cancel here, and first we'll follow a good practice of naming our pivot tables. We'll select our first pivot table here. We'll go to the pivot table Analyze tab here, and then we'll give that a name, which is going to be PVT Sales by Product. So this is going to be the name of our first pivot table, and then for our second pivot table, we'll give that PVT Sales by Region. And now if we right click on our slicer, go to Report Connections, you'll see here that we have PVT Sales by Product under the Connect Slicer to Multiple PTs sheet here, and then we'll also select to connect the slicer to PVT Sales by Region and click OK. And now PVT Sales by Region is also connected. So when we change the values here on the slicer, you can see here that the numbers change on both pivot tables. And of course, you can connect more than one slicer to the same pivot table as long as they have the same data source. However, if they don't have the same data source, then you need to use Power Pivot and the data model. And I have a video that introduces Power Pivot and the data model in Excel, and I'll leave you the link down below in the description. So that's trick number 3, which is connecting a slicer to multiple pivot tables. All right, so trick number 4 is creating a timeline. And a timeline is basically a slicer that is specialized for filtering date. So it only works with date fields in a pivot table. And to insert a timeline, we can just select any cell in our pivot table and then go to the Insert tab on the ribbon and then click on Timeline. And as you can notice, it's only giving me the option to insert a timeline based on the date field because it can only work with date fields in a pivot table. So I'll just check that and click OK. And as you can notice here, a timeline allows me to filter by either quarters or years or months. So for years, I can select an individual year or select both years. As you can notice here, for quarters, I can select actually Q1 from 2022 and Q4 from 2021. So my filter goes from Q4 2021 to Q1 2022. And for the months, I can select any number of months, and the same goes for days as well. And I can select an individual day or a range of days as well. So as you can notice here, a timeline is a great tool that I can use for filtering dates in a pivot table. And because timelines are like slicers, they can also be connected to multiple pivot tables at the same time. You can just right click and click on Report Connections and follow the same process for connecting slicers to multiple pivot tables. The fifth trick that we have here is performing a year-to-date calculation. And a year-to-date calculation is basically a calculation where the numbers accumulate as we go further into the year, and then the number in December should be equivalent to the total for the whole year, because when you're in May, the number would be the summation of the results from January to May. When you're in June, the number would be the accumulation or summation of results from January to June, and so on and so forth. So let's say that we're gonna do a year-to-date calculation for our sales amount, then we can just drag and drop another instance of the sales amount into the summation of values section here. And then we can just click on the field here and click on value field settings and then go to show values as, and then we'll select running total in, and we'll select our base field to be the months and then click OK. And as you can notice, now the numbers are basically the accumulation of the previous months. So for January, it's the same number here for the sales amount, and then for February, it's simply the summation of January and February, which is 505,108. And then for March, it's basically the summation of January, February, and March. And you can notice here that in December, the number is equivalent to the total of the whole year. And you can simply rename that. So you can name it YTD sales, for example, and you're good to go. So that's our fifth trick, which is creating a year-to-date calculation in Excel. And this year-to-date calculation is used in a lot of businesses, and it's a very important calculation to know. Trick number 6 is to create a year-over-year percentage difference calculation in a pivot table. So let's say that we want to perform a calculation that calculates the percentage of difference between the sales in the current year and the sales in the same month on the previous year. So we want to calculate the percentage difference between January 2022 and January 2021, and the same goes for February, so between February 2022 and February 2021, and so on and so forth. So how can we calculate that in pivot tables? So to do that, we're going to insert another instance of our sales amount field by dragging and dropping it to the summation of values section here, and then we can go to our new field that's been inserted, right click, and go to show values as and select percentage difference from. And then we're going to select our base field to be the years, and from the base item we're going to select previous because we want to compare to the previous year, and then click OK. And as you can notice here, we get the percentage difference between the current year and the previous year. So for January, we get negative 25.59%, and this is because the sales of January 2022 was less than the sales of January 2021 by 25.59%. And to do this calculation is simply the sales of the current year divided by the sales of the previous year minus 1, and as you can notice here, we get the same number. And of course, for 2021, we don't get any results because 2021 is the oldest year in our data, so there is no year previous to 2021 in our data, and hence we don't get any results in 2021. Another way to do it, of course, is to click on our field in the submission of values section here and click on value field settings, show values as, and then we'll select percentage difference from and select the years here as the base field and previous as the base item, and click OK, and this will also give you the same result. So that's how you can perform a year-over-year percentage difference calculation in pivot tables, which is an important calculation to know and is required in a lot of businesses. All right, so the next trick that we have here is allowing multiple filters per field. So let's say that we have this pivot table here where we have our products and we have the summation of sales amount for each product. And let's say we're going to apply a label filter, so a filter to our row labels that shows us only the products. So we're going to go to label filters here and we're going to show only the products that begin with MO. And we're going to click OK. So as you can see here, this filter has been applied and it's only showing us the products that begin with MO, which are mobile phone and motherboard. But let's say that we want to add another filter that shows us the products having a summation of sales amount less than 500,000. So this should show us only motherboard because the sales amount for motherboard is 411,987. So if we click on the filters button here and go to value filters, and we're going to apply a filter that is less than 500,000 on the sum of sales amount, and we're going to click OK. But as you can see here, we actually don't get motherboard. We get a set of different products. And this is because the second filter has not been added to the first filter. It's actually replaced our first filter. So how can we add the second filter to the first filter and not replace it? So to do that, we can just right click on our pivot table and then go to pivot table options, and then under totals of filters, we're going to select allow multiple filters per field. and we're gonna click OK. So this way, in addition to our value filter, we can apply also a label filter. So let's apply our label filter again here, which is MO, which is for products beginning with MO, and click OK, and we get our expected result, which is motherboard. So now we have two filters applied. If we click on the filter button here, you can see here we have two filters applied simultaneously, which are products that begin with MO and products with sales less than 500,000. So that's our 7th trick, which is allowing multiple filters per field. Our next trick is applying a top-end filter to your pivot table. So let's say that you have a pivot table that has the sales for each of your products and you want to show only the top 3 products in terms of sales. So you can click on the pivot table filter button here and go to value filters and click on top 10. And you can show the top 3 or top 4 or top 5 depending on the number that you're going to type here, or you can also show the bottom 3 products in terms of sales. And you're going to show the top 3 items by the sales amount and click OK. And as you can see here, we get the top 3 items in terms of sales. So that's an important trick to know, because in a lot of businesses, you'd want to know your top selling products or your top customers or your top performing employees, etc. Our next trick is repeating item labels in your pivot table. So let's say that you have this pivot table here where you have the years and the region and the product and the vendor in the rows area. And let's say that your manager asked you to change the layout of the pivot table so that each field would be in its own column. So you'd have the year in its own column, and then the region in its own column, and the product and the vendor each in their own columns as well, instead of being stacked here under the row labels column. So to do that, you can select any cell in your pivot table and then go to the design tab on the ribbon and click on report layout, and then change that to show in tabular form. And as you can see here, now each field is in its own column and your pivot table is in a tabular form. But let's say that your manager also asked you to fill the cells under each item here with that item. So you would have these cells having Bluetooth earbuds, these cells having charging pad, and all these blank cells having central, and all these blank cells as well having 2021. So to do that, you can again go to the design tab on the ribbon, click on report layout, and click on repeat all item labels. And this will fill the blank cells under each item. But let's say that your manager asked you to fill the cells only under the region column. So to do that, I'm just going to actually not repeat the item labels to put it back to where it was. And then to repeat the item labels for only a certain field or column, you can just right click on that field and go to field settings. And then under layout and print, you can just select repeat item labels. So check that and click OK. And as you can see here, now we have repeated the item labels for only the region field and not the other fields. So this is how you can repeat the item labels for only a specific field. Our last trick is turning off the GETPIVOTDATA function when referencing pivot tables. So sometimes when you reference a pivot table and you write equals and reference a cell in a pivot table, you get this GETPIVOTDATA function. And if you need to just reference the cell, you would just write the reference for the cell. So if it's cell B6, you just write B6. But how can you turn off this GETPIVOTDATA function? So to turn off the GETPIVOTDATA function and get only the cell reference, you can simply select any cell in your pivot table and then go to the pivot table analyze tab, and under options here you're gonna click on this arrow and then uncheck generate GETPIVOTDATA. And this way, when you reference your pivot table, you would only get the simple cell reference. And if you'd like me to make a video about the GETPIVOTDATA function, please let me know in the comments below. Alright guys, so that's it for today's video where we learned 10 advanced pivot table tricks in Excel. And if you'd like me to create more videos like this one to show you advanced pivot table tricks, then please let me know down below in the comments. Also, if you'd like to take your pivot table game to the next level and supercharge your pivot tables using DAX formulas and create data models using Power Pivot, then you can check my Excel, Power Pivot, and DAX course for beginners. I'll leave you the link with a special discount down below in the description. And if you found this video helpful, please make sure to like and share the video and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified with all future videos. And please also make sure to follow us on our social media. You'll find the links down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.